In April 1943, a British submarine surfaced off the coast of Spain and pushed a dead man into the sea. It was one of the most important things anybody did that year. A few hours later, a sardine fisherman working the water off Huelva found him. A body in a life jacket, drifting face down, wearing the uniform of a British officer. That in itself was not extraordinary in 1943, the Atlantic delivered bodies to that coast all the time. What was extraordinary was the briefcase. It was still attached to him, a leather case, chained to a belt around the waistband of his trousers, the way a courier carries something he cannot afford to drop. The body was landed at Huelva and laid out in the town mortuary. In his pockets, a wallet, a photograph of a fiancée, 2 love letters, a bill from a London club, a receipt for an engagement ring, an angry letter from his bank, and a book of stamps. In the briefcase, sealed official envelopes addressed to British generals in North Africa. And within a day of him coming ashore, 3 separate governments were quietly fighting over what was inside them. Every single thing about that man was false. The name was invented. The rank was invented. The fiancée was a girl in an office in London who had never met him. He had never served a day in the Royal Marines, and he had not drowned. Who he actually was would stay a secret for 53 years. What the papers in his briefcase did to the German army happened in about 6 weeks. Here is the problem that made a dead man necessary. By the spring of 1943 the Axis had lost North Africa. 250,000 German and Italian troops had surrendered in Tunisia, and the Allies were sitting on the southern shore of the Mediterranean with the largest amphibious force ever assembled and nowhere obvious to put it, except one place. Look at the map and the problem becomes obvious to anybody, including the enemy. Sicily is the stepping stone, it sits in the narrows between Tunisia and Italy, it controls the shipping lanes, and taking it opens the door to the Italian mainland. Churchill put it bluntly to his planners, everybody but a bloody fool would know it was Sicily. Which meant the German High Command already knew where the blow was coming, and had months to prepare for it. So British intelligence was given an assignment that sounds impossible when you say it out loud: convince Adolf Hitler that the obvious target was not the target. Persuade the German General Staff that the fleet massing in North Africa was going somewhere else entirely, and get them to move real divisions, real aircraft and real minefields to the wrong coastline, before the landing craft sailed. The idea they reached for had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1939. A memo from Naval Intelligence, listing 51 ways to mislead an enemy, a document largely drafted by a young officer on the director's staff named Ian Fleming, more than a decade before he invented James Bond. Item number 28 suggested planting misleading papers on a corpse and letting the enemy find it. It was, the memo admitted, an idea borrowed from a detective novel. 2 men were told to make it work, and they could not have been less alike. Charles Cholmondeley of the Royal Air Force, seconded to MI5, tall, awkward, a great inventor of improbable schemes. And Ewan Montague, a king's counsel from a wealthy banking family, a barrister who had spent his professional life persuading juries that a story was true. The photograph you are looking at was taken during the operation, with the van they used to move the body. Between them they built the plan around one insight that turns out to be the whole trick of deception: an enemy will not believe a document you hand him. He will believe a document he thinks he has stolen. Every element that followed existed to make the Germans feel clever, to let them think they had beaten British security, rather than been handed a story. First they needed a body, and that turned out to be the hardest part. It had to be a man of the right age. It had to show no injury that contradicted a plane crash at sea. It had to have lungs and organs consistent with drowning, so that a Spanish pathologist would sign the obvious conclusion. And it had to be obtained without telling the family what it was for, because the operation could not be explained to anyone, ever. The man they used was called Glyndwr Michael. He was 34 years old, Welsh, from Aberbargoed in the coal valleys. His father was a miner who had died, his mother had died too, he had no work, no home, and no one looking for him. In January 1943 he was found dying in a disused warehouse in London, having swallowed rat poison containing phosphorus. Whether it was suicide or a desperate man eating poisoned bread has never been settled. It is worth stopping on that, because the plan depended on him. The most successful deception operation of the Second World War was built on the body of a homeless man who had nothing, whose death nobody noticed, and who was given, by people who never knew his name, a rank, a uniform, a fiancée, a career, and a grave with flowers on it. Everything that man never had in life, the war invented for him after he died. So they built him. He became Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters. Royal Marines because the uniform was less common and the paperwork harder to check. Martin because there were several real Martins of the right rank on the list, in case anyone went looking. And a real service number, from a real sequence, because the one thing that kills a forgery is a number that does not exist. Then came the problem that nearly ended the operation. The identity card needed a photograph, and a photograph of a dead man looks exactly like a photograph of a dead man. They tried for weeks. In the end an MI5 officer named Ronnie Reed noticed he vaguely resembled the corpse, put on a Royal Marines uniform, and sat for the picture himself. The face on Major Martin's identity card belonged to a living intelligence officer who would outlive the war by 40 years. And then they filled his pockets, and this is where the operation becomes something close to novel writing. A fiancée called Pam, the photograph was of a clerk in the MI5 registry. 2 love letters, written by a colleague's friend, one of them scolding him for going away. A receipt from a Bond Street jeweler for an engagement ring, £53 and change, which was a great deal of money. A furious letter from his bank about an overdraft of £79. A book of stamps, a silver cross, a pencil stub, a used bus ticket, and 2 ticket stubs from a London theatre, dated to prove he had been alive in London days earlier. None of that was decoration. It was the argument. A forger builds a document, these men built a person, a slightly disorganized officer in love and mildly in debt, exactly like 10,000 real ones. And a person is much harder to disbelieve than a piece of paper. The payload itself was 1 letter, and its genius is that it never mentions the deception at all. It was written by the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Archibald Nye, to General Alexander in Tunisia, a personal, chatty letter between senior officers, complaining about medals and appointments. Buried in the middle of it, as an aside between friends, are the operational details. The coming assault will fall on Greece, and on Sardinia. And there is a cover plan, to make the enemy think the target is Sicily. Read that again, because it is the hinge of the entire war in the Mediterranean. The document does not deny Sicily. It admits Sicily, and explains it away as a trick. Which meant that every genuine sign of the real invasion the Germans picked up afterwards, every ship and every rumor pointing at Sicily, would confirm the lie instead of exposing it. A second letter, from Lord Mountbatten, explained why a mere major was carrying it. He was a specialist on landing craft, and the letters were too sensitive for the ordinary courier channels. It also made a joke about sardines, a nudge toward Sardinia so heavy that the planners argued about whether to leave it in. They left it in. The body was packed in a steel canister lined with dry ice, labeled optical instruments, and driven north through the night to Scotland. On the 30th of April, 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph surfaced in the dark about a mile off the Spanish coast near Huelva. This is Seraph, photographed on her return to Portsmouth later that year. Her captain, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, had told his crew the canister held a secret weather station, and sent them below. Only the officers were on deck. They opened the canister, inflated the life jacket, said the burial service over the body, none of them knew whose it was, and pushed him gently into the water, in a direction the tide would carry him ashore. Then they sank the canister and radioed one word to London. Why Welva? Because the British knew exactly who lived there. It was a small port with a very active German intelligence officer, a man named Adolf Klaus, who had spent years cultivating Spanish officials, and who could be relied upon to hear about a dead British courier within hours. Spain was neutral on paper. In practice, its police and naval staff leaked to Berlin as a matter of routine. And then the British did something that looks, at first glance, insane. They started demanding the briefcase back. Frantic signals went to the naval attaché in Madrid. Requests were made to the Spanish authorities, then repeated, with increasing urgency and decreasing discretion. All of it was theater, and all of it was calculated. Nothing convinces an intelligence service that a document is genuine quite like watching the other side panic about losing it. It worked. Under German pressure, Spanish naval intelligence took the sealed envelopes and did something delicate. They slid the letters out through the gap at the base of the envelopes without breaking the wax seals, dried the damp paper, photographed every page, then rolled the letters back in and returned everything to the British, with a straight face, and an assurance that nothing had been touched. The British had planned for exactly that. Before the briefcase left London, an eyelash had been sealed inside one of the folded letters. When the documents came back to the naval attaché, the eyelash was gone. It was the only proof they needed that somebody had opened them, and by then, the photographs were already on a desk in Berlin. On the 14th of May, British codebreakers reading German signal traffic picked up the confirmation. The German High Command had accepted the letters as genuine. The message that went to Winston Churchill, who was in Washington at the time, was short and has been quoted ever since: "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line and sinker." What followed was not a change of opinion. It was a change of map. Hitler issued a directive that measures regarding Sardinia and the Peloponnese took precedence over everything else. An entire panzer division was moved from France to Salonika in Greece. The German garrison on Sardinia was doubled. Minefields were laid off Greek beaches, torpedo boats were transferred, and Rommel himself was sent to Athens to command an army group that would be needed for the invasion that was never coming. The scale of it is what makes historians careful, and it should make us careful too. Hitler had been obsessed with the Balkans for years, they supplied his chrome and his oil, and he never trusted the Italians to hold anything. Mincemeat did not create that fixation. What it did was give it documentary proof, at the exact moment a decision had to be made. A good deception rarely changes a mind. It confirms the one the enemy already has. On the 9th of July, 1943, 160,000 Allied troops went ashore in Sicily in the largest amphibious operation attempted to that point in the war, bigger, on its first day, than the Normandy landings would be 11 months later. The planners had braced for a slaughter. They expected 10,000 casualties in the first week and the loss of some 300 ships. The actual figures were roughly 1,400 casualties, and 12 ships. Sicily was expected to take 90 days. It took 38. For 2 crucial days after the landings began, German commanders held back reserves, because the beaches in Sicily might still be the feint, and the real blow might still fall in Greece. It is impossible to say how many men are alive today because of a dead Welshman in a life jacket, and anyone who gives you a precise number is selling something. What can be documented is simpler. The Germans moved divisions away from the place the Allies were about to land, and kept them away while the beachhead was won. In Huelva, the Spanish buried Major William Martin with full military honors. The British vice-consul sent a wreath. A local woman laid flowers on the grave for years afterwards, and Montague, who had invented the man in the coffin, arranged for the grave to be tended. Every year on the anniversary, the flowers arrived from a fiancée who did not exist. Ewan Montague published the story in 1953 as The Man Who Never Was, and it became a bestseller and then a film, but he left the central fact out, because he had promised to. For 4 more decades, nobody outside a very small circle knew whose body had gone into the sea. It was not until 1996 that an amateur historian named Roger Morgan, working through recently opened files, found the name in a footnote, Glyndwr Michael. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission added a line to the stone in Welva the following year. It still says Major William Martin, and underneath, it now says, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin. A homeless man from a Welsh mining valley, buried under someone else's name, with his own name finally added below it, 54 years late. So here is the question this operation leaves. Everything that made mincemeat work was a kind of cruelty done kindly. A man with no family was used because he had no family, a woman's photograph was borrowed for a romance that never happened, an enemy was persuaded to move his armies by a letter that was a lie inside a joke about sardines. And thousands of men who never heard any of it walked off a beach in Sicily alive. Was it worth it? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.